Thank God.
Oh, welcome everyone. I'm Jim Goldgeier, research affiliate here at CSAC and CDDRL, and it's just a great pleasure to have you all here for this book launch, book talk. I am, in addition to be a research affiliate here, I am co-editor of the Oxford University Press Bridging the Gap book series, which seeks to publish policy-relevant academic books. And our newest book in the series is The Hand Behind Unmanned. So we're just thrilled that Jackie and Julia McDonald published in the series. Jackie Schneider is the Hargrove Hoover Fellow at the Hoover Institution, the director of the Hoover Wargaming and Crisis Simulation Initiative, and an affiliate with CSAC. Research focuses on the intersection of technology, national security, and political psychology, with a special interest in cybersecurity, autonomous technologies, war games, and Northeast Asia. And she was previously an assistant professor at the Naval War College. And I have known Jackie and her co-author, Julia McDonald, since they were star PhD students at George Washington University. And it's just been a great joy to watch Jackie's career flourish. So congrats on the book. We're really thrilled for you, and we're eager to hear the talk.
Thank you. I guess I'll go up to the podium so I can control my slides because this hand is not unmanned. Okay. So really excited to be here. This is a book that started with research that Julia and I did, actually started when we were in graduate school. When we were in graduate school, and it's funny, like when I realized that graduate school was almost absolutely 10 years ago is when I feel very, very old, which I don't always feel at Hoover, but at this moment, feeling very old. So that was, kind of the 2013s, mid 2010s. And if you're old like me, you remember that we were in the midst of a counterinsurgency fight. And Julia and I started working on research where we were talking to the combat controllers that were calling in the bombs and the missiles actually in the fight in Afghanistan and Iraq. And we did a survey experiment and interviews asking them about their preference for manned versus unmanned systems. And it was really interesting. We were in this plenary, and it was a bunch of Marine JTACs. And the Marine said, everyone had been complaining how they didn't trust the RPAs and the unmanned systems. And this one guy raised his hand. He must have been a captain or a major. And he said, I hear you all, but it doesn't matter. Unmanned is in the future, and we have to get on board. I thought, well, this is fundamentally interesting. There is this kind of like belief and inevitability in these unmanned systems. And so when we started writing the book, the real puzzle was, wow, like, why was there this sense of inevitability? And why were we so invested in these remotely piloted aircraft? Now, books take a while. And there have been some pretty big things that have happened in the world since we started this book. And what started as a puzzle really for Julia and I, which everyone else thought was not really a puzzle, I think is more apparent as a puzzle now, because the systems that we invested in over 20 years in counterinsurgency in Iraq and Afghanistan turned out not to be the unmanned systems that are used in Ukraine, Russia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, the Houthi rebels, right? So now we have this arsenal of unmanned systems that no longer feel inevitable and instead feel like, hey, why did we make the choices that we did? And that is what motivates the book. So I want to start with this quote. It says, we have just won a war with a lot of heroes flying around in planes. The next war may be fought with airplanes with no men in them at all. Take everything you've learned about aviation and war and throw it out of the window, and let's go to work on tomorrow's aviation. It will be different from anything the world has ever seen. Any guesses on who that was? It was Hap Arnold. That's 1945 in his speech about the victory in Japan. All this to show this idea of taking the man out of the cockpit, about searching for autonomous ways of substituting technology for humans on the battlefield, is not a new pursuit. So here's kind of like the big puzzles that we're wrestling with in this book. The first, as I've already alluded to, is why did the US invest in an unmanned arsenal that was dominated by expensive and remotely controlled exquisite aircraft? And then the second, and I think, I'll throw it out there. I'm an Air Force veteran. I've spent almost 20 years as an Air Force active duty and as a reservist. I'm married to a pilot. This second question is like, why did the Air Force, the service of pilots, end up leading that investment in basically unmanned aircraft over that 30 years? And then kind of more practical, why was the US not equipped with the types of unmanned munitions that you have been shown in Ukraine and other parts of the world to be so effective and important in what is modern warfare? So I want to start this with a little Donald Mackenzie. The world is not the product of technology developing autonomously. It is not brought about by benignly rational decision-making, but by mundane social processes. And that's what the aim of the book is. So here's the argument in a nutshell. And I don't think this will surprise many people. Buying weapons is not strictly rational. Quite often in political science, we use kind of GDP as a proxy variable. And there's this assumption that you invest more in technology or invest more in capacity, you get a more effective military. But the fact of the matter is that it is not a straight line to how and why we buy certain weapons. And quite often we're buying weapons in the absence of an understanding of how those technologies will affect the battlefield. So faced with that uncertainty, especially about emerging technologies, individuals and organizations have to rely on something else besides a math equation. And that is beliefs and identities. Beliefs about what future war will be, beliefs about how technology will influence future war. And even more important to how we decide to adopt certain beliefs is the identities that we bring with us. So organizational identities, occupational identities. And it's these kind of not strictly rational beliefs and identities that actually determine the shape of an arsenal, not strictly rational thoughts. So the book details a messy knot. I know sometimes social scientists, we want to get rid of endogeneity and kind of tease out clear relationships. This book is not that. This book is the opposite, where we're trying to show the entanglement, the entwining, the complicated relationships that make up the story of how we invest in certain types of weapons. And this is a story of policy entrepreneurs, of critical junctures, and path dependencies that all tell the story about how ideas become budget lines. So where do these beliefs about unmanned systems come from, and which ones have dominated the US's weapons arsenal over the last 30 years? So first I want to start with a little bit of definition. What do we mean by unmanned? And we got a lot of pushback about using unmanned. This is not the term du jour of the day. Uncrewed, uninhabited, remotely piloted. There's lots of different words, but really what we mean, and it's kind of a mouthful, so we chose not to use it, is we really mean unhuman. We really mean the act of taking the human further away from the actual act of violence. Now, the act of unhumaning means that platforms and munitions and different types of military systems can have a range of autonomy to accomplish the mission. So it's not binary. You're not autonomous or not autonomous. Instead, you can have kind of dumb automation. You can have all the way up to the type of autonomy where they're making their own choice, the weapon's making its own choices. So that's both a technological differentiation, but it's also a human choice about how much autonomy we're willing or that we want the weapon system or platform to have. There's also a difference in mission, right? You can be, we've seen unmanned systems focused on intelligence, on strike, logistics, communications. So you have the ability as the organization or the entity buying the system to make choices about those different characteristics. And finally, and I think this is actually very apropos for today, thinking about what's going on in Ukraine versus what the US is invested in, is there's a real kind of trajectory difference between the investment in unmanned platforms, uncrewed systems, versus a munition, which is not necessarily uncrewed, but it doesn't have a human there actually taking at the point of violence. Now, all of these different characteristics trade off different kind of characteristics of the battlefield. So when you're making choices about the spectrum of autonomy, the mission, the platform versus munition, you're also making choices about what characteristics of warfare you think are most important. So precision, persistence, lethality, mass, speed. Not all weapon systems can have all of these things. And so you have to make choices. And it's these ideas about the future of war that leads you to prioritize these different wartime characteristics. So the story is not necessarily about manned versus unmanned, though that is important. It's instead how our different ideas and beliefs influence these different potential choices in the world of unmanned systems. Okay, so in the book, we really focus on the world of 9/11 and beyond, and the role in which two main beliefs and one identity really shapes these decisions. But the decisions made 9/11 and beyond are, a product of decisions made for many, many years. So if you look at the development of unmanned systems, some of it's a story of technological changes, right? You need the microprocessor, for example, to move into something that is more autonomous, that is more able to proliferate across the battlefield. But it's also a story of context and choices that we make about organizations and about the strategic world that we live in. So if you look in the time period leading up to World War I, it's a time period where you don't have a lot of technology that allows you tons of autonomy. But you do see innovations in, for example, the naval sphere. So interestingly enough, like as early as the mid 1800s, you have relatively sophisticated torpedoes and mines. And they're somewhat unguided, and they're working with wires and kind of klutzy and clumsy relationships with the platforms that are using them, but they are being used in warfare as early as the mid 1800s. In the air, we see less innovation. This is kind of a technological artifact because with the inability to communicate, so before radio is developed, you're basically just putting stuff out and you don't really know if it's going to be able to come back. So you have early attempts at unmanned balloons and the Kettering bug, but these are really just kind of experimental. Leading into World War II, you see that you have some pretty significant increases in unmanned innovation. Now, part of that, once again, is technology. The most important being the development of radio and the ability to communicate and somewhat control technology over longer distances. But you see the Navy, which is the leader in unmanned innovation up to World War II, up to World War I, also continues to lead in some of the interwar training. They're working with unmanned surface vessels, they're working with unmanned aerial vehicles, but it's kind of in an experimentation phase. They had the early lead on torpedoes and mines, but the US doesn't like torpedoes and mines. So the US actually shelved our torpedoes and mines and took it down to a very, very, very limited capacity leading up to World War II. In World War II, you see the shock of battle becoming the galvanizer for unmanned innovation. And so you see for the first time the development of unmanned aerial vehicles, though with a really not great past. I mean, John F. Kennedy's older brother ends up dying in one of these unmanned experiments. Is it really dangerous? It's like they had a big manned bomber, and then they had these smaller bombers that were supposed to be kind of like kamikaze, but you had to have a pilot in them initially, piloting them towards the target, and then they would jump out. It didn't work, and actually, John F. Kennedy's brother died in that. So not super successful, but what you'd see at the end of the war is the development of long-range rockets and missiles. And that takes us into a really, really important trajectory for unmanned systems in the Cold War, which is the focus on nuclear-armed ballistic missiles. Part of this is a product of context, right? You have a Sputnik moment that's really, really important. You also have a new service, and that new service wants to make sure that it has everything in the air. So it is willing to adopt technologies that it wouldn't otherwise because it doesn't want the Navy or the Army to have them. So you see here that the focus is on strategic. The torpedo and mine development really stagnates. And then kind of cruise missiles are explored only half-heartedly. So the focus really is on nuclear, strategic, mostly missiles. There's some innovation attempts with like long-range strategic reconnaissance, but it's too expensive and not useful. Now that leads into Vietnam. And I think one of the lessons we get out of this for military innovation, which anybody who studies military innovation knows, is that war drives tactical innovation. So whereas the focus in the early Cold War is strategic, by the time we're getting to Vietnam, we're seeing a lot of innovation when it comes to UAVs actually on the battlefield, for reconnaissance, for bait, and then you see a renewed interest in guided munitions. So you start seeing the semi-active things like the HARM. You start seeing the development of laser guided and actually kind of discussions about, hey, can we use something else for guiding? So these kind of tactical improvements in missiles only occurs kind of later in the Cold War. And part of this is because there's this big strategic context. Ballistic missiles become part of the negotiation strategy between the US and the USSR. So whereas the services have primarily invested, the Navy and the Air Force have primarily invested in ballistic missiles, by the time we get to Vietnam, they're using those ballistic missiles instrumentally in negotiations. And so instead, you see a development of cruise missiles. But not everyone likes cruise missiles. It's not like a perfect story for cruise missiles. I'll talk a little bit about the Air Force, but the Air Force goes out of its way to try and kill cruise missiles over and over again. Moving into the post-Cold War, you have a focus on the Powell Doctrine, force protection. We're in a moment of hegemony where we want to only go into wars that we win decisively. And there's a real quest for using technology to substitute for human lives on the battlefield. In this kind of quest for that type of warfare, long-range warfare, you see that cruise missiles are prioritized. We get a renewed focus on precision-guided munitions, and this is happening kind of at the beginning of what we call the PGM revolution. So we're learning, wow, we can make things, with the advent of computers and microprocessors and this digital revolution, we can make things that are much more precise and be able to launch them from much further. And really going into 9/11, the remotely piloted unmanned aircraft is a bit of a novelty. There are a few. They're flying over Kosovo. There's some definitely interest from the intelligence organizations, some members of the Air Force, but mostly this is kind of a back burner idea. And interestingly enough, General Atomic actually invests in these remotely piloted aircraft with very limited requirements or kind of desire from the services. Now that all changes in September 11th. So September 11th, it goes from being a niche or intelligence capability to something that they're willing to finally use for strike. And you see like James Roche, who's the Secretary of the Air Force, and leaders in the Air Force much more willing to use remotely piloted aircraft. Now that comes up against kind of the pilot identity. So what is interesting there is that you find that the Air Force is adopting these systems that basically look like manned systems. I mean, it even looks like it has a cockpit in the front. And it's thinking of them in the same strategic ways that it thought of air power going into the Cold War. So this leads to kind of, the world that we're in today, where we have a lot of these unmanned area vehicles, while at the same time, some of ballistic missiles and conventional missiles stagnate. Almost no innovation when it comes to mines. And so this is the world that we enter today. Oh, how do we get there? This is Frank Kendall, former Secretary of the Air Force. We interviewed him about the role that service identity played. And he says, if war becomes robotic, it gets to everybody's tread. And that leads us to what I would say, like, if I was going to call something the null hypothesis of the book, it's this: that absent anything else in a status quo environment, it is service identity that is going to mostly drive the technological investments. And here I want to refer back to the extraordinary work from the 1980s of Carl Bilder, The Masks of War, in which he identifies these different kind of service identities for the Air Force, the Navy, and to some extent the Marines. So what does that mean? That means that because of service identity, you get a bias towards systems that support service identity. Here's a great example for the Air Force. You see this first quote. This is Theodore von Karman. He says, "We use the term pilotless aircraft to cover all type of missiles so as to prevent the project from falling into the hands of the Army." So this is from the late 1940s, early 1950s. At the end of World War II, there are 47 different rocket and missile programs that are currently underway. Obviously, that needs to dwindle down. You have smaller kind of post-war budgets. The Air Force is trying to figure out who it wants to be, and it knows that what it doesn't want is for the Army or the Navy to have the primary missions in the skies. So even though there is this kind of reluctance and just distaste for unmanned missiles, they're willing to adopt them in order for the Army or the Navy not to be the sole procurers of these systems. And you watch this with Curtis LeMay, who's like the quintessential strategic bomber, loves his manned airplanes, and yet is willing to adopt unmanned missiles in order to make sure that he keeps that mission for the Air Force. Later on, when the Air Force is trying to justify the B-1 bomber during Carter administration. So they're trying to justify the B-1 bomber. And Congress is saying, I'm not sure we need the B-1 bomber. Why don't we just buy a lot of these new cruise missiles? That seems like a more cost-effective option for us and potentially kind of more effective. So the Air Force is like, no, you don't understand. These cruise missiles have horrible guidance. We're just using them as decoys. They're really bad. And they show all these kind of test results of the cruise missiles failing. But the Navy at the same time is developing the Tomahawk, and they're having a decent amount of success. And so the Navy is able to kind of figure out this guidance issue. And Congress says to the Air Force, well, looks like the Navy's figured it out. I guess you guys can we'll still get rid of the B-1, but you can start flying the Tomahawk on all your aircraft. And at that point, this Air Force general says, we better get serious about the outcome unless we want a torpedo rammed up its bomb bay. So that led to kind of a compromise where they got a few B-1s and actually paid attention to the cruise missiles. But in general, this is what the Air Force is going to do. It's not that they're not going to adopt unmanned systems. It's that they're going to adopt unmanned systems that support, that don't directly threaten manned platforms. And I think there's a real power of warfare communities in each of these services, in the Navy in particular. So the Navy's kind of service identity is tradition and autonomy on the sea. But the Navy is also, I don't know how many Navy people are in here, it's like the least joint service that exists, because every element exists already in the Navy. You know, you've got an Air Force, you've got the Marines who are your land element. So the Navy, the fight doesn't really occur necessarily against the other services, but instead amongst itself. And so you get this fight between the pilots, the surface warfare, the subsurface warfare. And I think one of the best examples of kind of how different kind of balances of power between those communities affected unmanned systems is in ballistic missiles. So the Navy wanted no part in ballistic missiles. They initially had a co-sponsored project with the Army, and they launched one off a carrier, and the carrier exploded. It was, you know, a ground dock. And the Navy was like, absolutely not going to do it. Bad idea, right? And so they actually moved to cruise missile development early on. But then there was a gentleman named Rickover. And Rickover really wanted nuclear-powered submarines. But submarines kind of been relegated to a not high priority in the Cold War Navy. Like, what are we doing with these submarines, right? Like, we're not going to shoot other submarines, so what's the point? And he kind of suggests and pioneers this idea of ballistic missiles from submarines. And so this policy entrepreneur who actually has this extraordinary longevity, very extraordinary in the Department of Defense, is able to reinvent the Navy's, the subsurface warfare's identity. And because the munition, the unmanned munition, so actively supports that manned platform, it becomes a large part of the Navy procurement process. If you feel like I'm not talking about the Army, it's because I'm not. the army here ends up, the army's focus is always on the human element and the citizenry. And it's not that the army doesn't invest in unmanned systems. I think the army actually quite often tries to invest in unmanned systems that are organic to the core army unit. But as soon as it hits the Air Force is very protective, and the army tends to cede that to the Air Force because it's not core to their identity. In fact, the last conventional missiles were army missiles, and the Air Force was tired of the army having a missile. So like, we'll take it. The army is like, we're not that into it anyway. And there was the Pershings, and eventually they just kind of disappeared because the Air Force didn't really want to invest in them either. So, I mean, the Army does try to invest in unmanned systems. And I think when you go into the 2000s, they invest in the Future Integrated Combat System, which is a big package of manned platforms, as well as unmanned sensors, unmanned small aircraft. And the idea is that these things are all working together to help to build a cohesive unmanned manned inventory for the army. It ends up being like a far too complicated, and also the army tends to over invest and focus on the manned platforms, and the unmanned kind of gets lost in it. So I think it's not that the army is not a character, it's just that I was explaining this to my 12-year-old, it's just that like the Air Force has got like main character energy in this book. So that's the main identity. And those identities shape what beliefs each of the services choose to adopt when they're deciding what weapons to buy. They don't necessarily create the beliefs about the future of warfare. And I think Julie and I argue there are two main beliefs that define 30 years of US weapons acquisition. This is a quote from the 2001 Quadrennial Defense Review. So we get to talk about RMA. And so RMA is one of the big beliefs that we identify as shaping the U.S. arsenal. So RMA is fascinating. You guys may, I don't know, I'm feeling old sometimes in this room. Y'all may not know it as RMA, third offset, military revolutions. There's like a slew of different words that are basically all the same thing. And it's this idea that technology has this ability to create leapfrog, revolutionary changes in military effectiveness. And so the idea is that if you invest in the right technology and you adapt your tactics and your organization to that technology, you will therefore naturally progress. It's like somewhat, I could say Hegelian, but really it's somewhat Marxist. And actually the idea does come straight from Marx. So this is a Soviet idea that Andy Marshall actually finds as they're going through all this Soviet material. And he says, I think the Soviets called it like military technological revolution. So Andy Marshall becomes really interested in this idea. And here's a really, really interesting example of an idea that is not organic to the Department of Defense. Instead, it is created in a tiny office in the bowels of the Pentagon by an office that has no budget authority. It has no like significant manpower, and yet he's creating ideas. So we see over a 30-year time period, Andy Marshall is investing in people who are writing historical books about military revolutions, who are writing essays, and he's proliferating them within professional military education institutions. And so you have this idea, they're populating the Quadrennial Defense Review. And so these ideas about how unmanned can create this new technological revolution. And for this revolution in military affairs, it's really about how unmanned works with other technologies of the digital revolution for speed and range. And it is about decreasing the amount of time between deciding to shoot something and actually shooting something. And so they're somewhat agnostic about the type of unmanned that you're investing in, but you're definitely looking for wars of overwhelming technological dominance that are fought at long range, high precision, and quite quickly. Now, in contrast, or happening at the same time, you have this idea of force protection and casualty aversion. And this is the time period coming out of, Colin Powell. You've got an American military that's watched Somalia occur. And the focus on military effectiveness becomes not just in winning campaigns, but winning campaigns with as little lives lost as possible. a lot of it is a product of the Vietnam War, right? You have a generation of officers that come up from that and are very concerned about using technology to substitute for the human. And so these two ideas, this idea about technology to create these fast, precise conflicts, and then this kind of concern about casualty aversion and public acceptance of loss, they come together. And they actually are somewhat contradictory, because the type of systems that are being advocated by like casualty aversion, they're exquisite and they have persistence, and they're focused. They're not necessarily making war faster, they're just making war somewhat cleaner, right? But they have to coexist because they're dominant understandings and beliefs, and so they're working kind of with each other to try and advocate for different military systems. Now those ideas, some of them are organic. This idea about Vietnam and casualty aversion, it's organic. It comes from generations of officers, right? So you're not propagating it. You're not trying to convince people. It just is. It exists, right? Whereas ideas coming from people like Andy Marshall, not an officer, a Pentagon career bureaucrat, these are ideas that are not necessarily organic. Instead, where it's an example of an idea that is created and then proliferated. So identities matter most. Beliefs mediate identities. And then finally, you have this exogenous push and pull on technological investments. War always as the arbiter. So that creates a focus on tactical over strategic. In my book, Julie and I debated this. In our book, Congress and the executive is a force for good. You know, the services have their kind of null going in what we're going to buy, but the Congress and the executive to some extent can arbitrate those identities. And it also pushes different beliefs about the future of war onto the services. And then finally, this idea of path dependencies become really important to understanding these budget choices. So up here on the top, I have a picture of, that is actually the air-land battle concept in the Core 86. So air-land battle comes right after Goldwater Nichols, this huge infusion of money from the Reagan administration, and then we win the Cold War and we see budgets dwindle. So a lot of the technology that we are using over the next 20 years comes out of this acquisition choice that was made in the mid 80s. So you have these like really important path dependencies. And actually, if you really get into this Core 86 program and air-land battle, you'll find that many of the systems that we were giving to the Ukrainians came from this set of choices. Okay, so what does that mean for emerging technologies? I think for cyber, it becomes like this hard case for investment, because is this inherently joint, it's virtual, it's a system, not a platform. So any success that the US has had in investing in cyber systems is kind of counterintuitive. But what we see with that is that there is a real power of policy entrepreneurs and narratives. And so you have people like Nakasone and before him, Alexander, that are carving out a place for a technology that is inherently joint. And this is very, very strange. Part of why they have been successful is they have had supporters in Congress and Cyberspace Solarium Commission that are protecting them. But in general, those type of joint organizations usually fail. Similar problems when we come to investments in information technology, especially in any joint information technology. And there's very little service incentive for innovation because it is not closely aligned to identity. And I think if I was telling Congress, what do we need to do to invest more in technology, in information technology, I would say, tell the Air Force they're going to have to use the Navy system. And then that will probably work. Space is an interesting, Space Force is not a part of this book, partly because when it was written. But I think you have here a case where a service is trying to find its identity. And in that quest to find its identity, there is a real challenge that they will only invest in technology that is specific to their domain and not technology that enables other domains. So focus on space versus space, instead of a focus on enabling capabilities. And then conventional strike. So it's interesting, conventional strike has become a really, really important part of the arsenals of a lot of rising militaries. The Chinese, for example, but I mean, even the Houthi rebels, right? Like this missile on missile type of conflict is huge right now. And yet the US has a relatively small arsenal of very exquisite things that are launched from manned platforms. That may change. The Army may feel like they want to get back into this business. But unless the Army really, really pushes to get back into the conventional strike business, I think it's highly unlikely that the Air Force will get super invested. And I think the kind of service identity can help explain why we've seen so little progress on hypersonic missiles compared to others. Okay, that was a lot I threw at you guys. I'm excited to talk more about the book and the ideas behind why we invest in what we invested in for the unmanned arsenal.
Awesome. Thanks, Jackie. Jackie, and we'll have a seat, and we'll open it up. And just a reminder, there are books for sale over there in the corner, thanks to the Stanford Bookstore. So appreciate that. We'll start with fellows and students. That's okay. Yes, Divya, go ahead, please.
Sorry, I wasn't sure if that was eligible.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Divya. Jackie, thank you so much for your presentation. I have a question about how you think about the rise of automation, but also our decreasing working age male population for war. And Mr. Stalin has this really famous quote, right? Quantity can be quality in itself. And I'm wondering how you think about how the American identity around military dominance changes when we have less people with the chance of fewer automation. Does the American military then move to replace people, machines, et cetera, et cetera?
So interestingly enough, the US has not used automation or unmanned systems as a way to substitute technology for human labor. If they were, you would see a lot more investment in automation for administrative purposes that would decrease the burden on manpower. That is not happening. And actually, I think one of the puzzles has been remotely piloted aircraft have an extraordinarily complex logistical tail. The amount of people in remotely piloted aircraft unit is sometimes actually more than the manned unit, because you have to also staff it with individuals who can deal with the communications link. You have the pilots, but you also have sensor operators. You have this whole kind of processing and distribution kind of manpower. So one of the puzzles we came into the book with was, why were we investing in things that did not actually substitute the labor? Like, it removed the human from the battlefield, but it didn't necessarily remove the human from the task. And when you look at Ukraine, I think that they're trying to think about how they can do that, because that is exactly one of the problems they have, is the lack of kind of human manpower. And we've made arguments about economic costs and how, Julia and I's theory is that really we should be investing in autonomy that significantly increases the ability to sustain conflict over time. And that over the last 20, 30 years, the US invested in technology that sustained the decreased political costs, but at the expense of economic costs, and probably at the expense of labor costs. And so are we going to see a big shift when we think about a more long-term warfare, or watching how the Ukrainian war has turned out? People talking about precision mass, or using autonomy as a way to create quantity in wars of attrition or campaigns of attrition. And Replicator, I think, is an effort to try and start doing that kind of task. But I don't think the US has not strictly been thinking about that as a labor, as a way to substitute for labor. But I think that there's a strong argument to be made that it should have been, or should be in the future.
Okay, we'll go to Ryan next, and then if there's any other fellows, we'll do that, and then we'll go. Oh, okay, great. Why don't you guys both go? Then I have Harold, Paul, and Rose. So
Ryan Gladding, Army War College Fellow, visiting scholar here at CSAC. I love your comment. Great talk, please, by the way, and great book. I'm looking forward to reading it. I think your comments on service culture are spot on. particularly with the Army, my service, and the reluctance to invest in automated systems. And I grew up in mechanized units. If a Bradley fighting vehicle was broken, the squad would get off and continue to fight. And I think that's part of the Army's culture. But as we're seeing an increase in looking at your other point on decreases or minimizing casualties and things like that, do you see the Army investing in autonomous land-based systems, particularly in the sustainment logistics field, to try to drive some of those down? Have you seen any indications of that in any of your research?
Yeah, so here's an example where technology is an important variable. So the cluttered ground environment has made it more difficult for autonomous land-based systems. And in fact, in World War II, there was a system called the Goliath that was supposed to be used to destroy mines, which is a really good use of unmanned, actually. But the units would actually leave the Goliath behind because it had such a high logistical tail. And like, as you know, I mean, you just said like the Bradley breaks, you get out the Bradley, right? If you are on the ground and you have a system that is going to slow you down or become to something difficult to maintain, it won't get used in combat. And I think that's been one of the big challenges is how do you use autonomy in a ground combat in a way that doesn't increase the logistical cost to the user. I think that if anyone is going to adopt small copters, it will be the Army or the Marines. And I think that there's a really good chance that we'll see that type of adoption of unmanned systems, these smaller, more organic aerial systems. Actually, I think the Army would have done it years ago if the Air Force hadn't been fighting them for so long. The question for me, and maybe this is a question going back to you, is we've seen that in the Ukrainian war, the mines matter. And the US has gotten out of the business of mines and to some extent demining. But here's a real kind of way in which new autonomous technology might make both mining and demining more effective on the battlefield with less potential for damage. Do you think that they'll invest in mines?
I mean, it's a great question. Obviously, there's treaties against, indiscriminate mining and dumb mines, basically, and all of our mine systems have a timer of some sort or some sort of other destruct mechanism. But I mean, I guess I struggle with it because the biggest vulnerabilities in a land-based conflict are our logistics forces. And to automate that and our counter mine forces and our route clearance and all the things that we struggled with in decades of counterinsurgency, those are all prime opportunities to automate. Yet the Army's been very, very slow at doing that. And obviously it's very difficult to modernize the Army. And I think there is initiatives to do this, but I just was curious on your opinion. Hopefully that helps.
The challenge with like unmanned platforms for logistics, the other challenge, and I think the Army has to carry everything. I think powering a lot of this has been a real challenge. Like, are you carrying batteries? How long do those batteries last? Where do the batteries get refueled? This idea of autonomy on the battlefield is a direct connection with energy on the battlefield. And that I think is something we haven't worked out yet. It's not very sexy. So like I can't see how many startup companies I've heard of that talk about drones, but how many of them are talking about energy? Like that's.
We'll go to Mike and then we'll go to Harold.
Mike Madam, a National Defense Fellow, Active Duty Air Force, and I'm a B-52 defensive systems operator as well as a JTAC.
Oh wow!
Yeah, so
there's not very many of that.
Yeah, not many. I guess my question is, in your book, do you get into risk? Do you discuss the risk? Because I think as a guy on the ground and a guy in the air, that's one of the biggest driving factors. In the B-52 specifically, there's a thing called an acceptable level of risk. And the importance of the mission will drive up the risk that the commander is willing to accept. So in nuclear operations, the risk is extreme, right? Because the importance of the mission, you're willing to sacrifice X number of aircraft in order to complete the mission. And then with the exquisite weapons, those are great. I think they're awesome, but they're limited, like you said. So the risk to failure of mission versus the risk to unmanned aircraft, and then deferring to manned aircraft, I think is really what kind of is the driving factor when you look at the unmanned versus the manned aspect. In the buff and the nuke mission, what you get with that is you get the ability to turn the mission off or change the mission set for a longer amount of time. Because ICBMs, once they're gone. Subs, same thing once they're out. Whereas the aircraft, you have all that time driving to hopefully come up with some sort of an agreement with the enemy nation in order to either turn that off or redirect those missiles to a new target as things evolve. So have you examined, or do you examine in your book the level of risk to both manned aircraft as well as the risk of failure to the mission set, and how that affects the decision to go unmanned versus manned?
Yes, that was a huge portion of how the role of force protection and casualty aversion and the decisions. And I think that a lot of our decisions made over a 30-year time period were to decrease the risk to the manned pilot, but we were in a relatively permissive air environment. And so we could decrease risk to manned pilot by just not having them there, right? Like just no accidents, like it's less risk in general. But we could do that because we weren't actually sacrificing much when it came to risk to the actual mission.
Right.
I think we're watching that risk analysis change in Ukraine, right? Where the risk is not just like manned versus unmanned, well, you should unmanned, but like, can that platform actually perform the mission that it was required to do? And I think you see some really active experimentation, right? So yes, there are a lot of drones in Ukraine, the small copters especially, but also they are getting shot down at an extraordinary rate. And that does affect some of their ability to accomplish the mission. So like they're going back to wired cables to control some of those systems. So I think it dominated the US's decisions over a 30-year time period. The question is, I see it come up less today when they're talking about, for example, the Air Force's efforts to invest in like the unmanned that's going to be tied to a manned platform. And you don't hear them talking about that risk equation quite as much as they did in the 90s and the early 2000s. So I think that risk equation is changing, but you're absolutely right. It dominated our decisions over a 30-year time period.
I would say the other factor too is just cost in general, right? So a lot of the standoff stuff and unmanned stuff is incredibly expensive, and as they get shot down at some point, whether you're in the Congress or you're deal with the budget, at what point do you say this is too costly for what we're getting out of it, and we're better off going with a less exquisite weapon set with a manned aircraft or a dumb bomb?
And that's a big shift
so
that's happening literally right now. I mean, you hear Trump saying, I want attritable drones. Like, those are missiles, but like, that I think you hear a change. And when you hear people talking about precision mass, and you hear people talking about trying to use unmanned in these attritable ways, it is about decreasing costs. I personally think this should be one of the primary determinations about how and why we invest in different types of weapon systems. Our arsenal of munitions in general is relatively low and very expensive. The cost ratio with every one of these engagements with the Houthis is ridiculous. So hopefully it will be a consideration in the future.
Thanks.
We'll go to Harold, Paul, and Rose, and then I'll see if there's any questions online. So don't hesitate to put something in the Q&A if you are online. Harold.
Jackie, for this talk. I wanted to ask you more about the adoption of the RMA. I thought it was sort of fascinating that it's Andy Marshall, Office of Med Assessment, tiny little almost think tank in the Pentagon, is popularizing this. And in contrast to your story about casualty aversion, which I think makes sense, or the experience of war, Vietnam, I can figure out whether RMA or the military technical revolution is appealing to the Soviets, right? Because it's remote control, basically. They were interested in cybernetics, they're interested in central planning, achieve effects on the battlefield at distance. The generals don't really trust their troops. So this is, they don't have the technology, but I could see why it appeals to them. What about the RMA is so appealing? Because I remember it wasn't just that it's Andy Marshall. He wasn't fighting uphill exactly, as I recall. This was actually something that people got quite enthusiastic about. And that's why there's this whole proliferation of literature on it. So can you talk a little bit more about that period? And so what about RMA was appealing US military, which is not so obvious that you might have that same thing that the Soviet general staff might imagine.
Yeah. And part of it was this real excitement that you could use technology in a way that could allow you to fight very short wars of coercion in a very dominant way. And so here are these new technologies coming out of the digital revolution that are going to offer the ability to do exactly the kind of warfare that Colin Powell is advocating. I think it landed on really good ears. And then you see in the first Gulf War, so the ideas coming out of the kind of articulation of this as a belief or as a like firm idea starts in like the early 90s, in like the late 80s, early 90s, and then Gulf War happens, and suddenly it looks like it's yes, we got it right. And in fact, if you read Dick Cheney's discussion about the war, he uses some of the language from the military revolutions. You have to understand, like a lot of the folks, like the Rumsfeld, the Dick Cheneys, there's a whole group of Bush people who had been in government with the Andy Marshall people before, right? So like they're very closely aligned at that point. So there's a real desire, I think, in the US, and you see some like you had the Army Future Integrated Combat System as an example of them taking this idea and trying to manifest it in an acquisition. But I think even though people liked the idea, when it came to practice, because it didn't really articulate like here's exactly what you should buy, it was more thinking about like how all these systems came together. You ended up with this hodgepodge of different technologies that didn't fully ever realize the networked cybernetic kind of warfare that Andy Marshall was envisioning at the time. So it was an idea that people loved. They still talk about it. It went out of vogue for a little bit during the coin. Like we were like, oh, we don't talk about revolutions. And, oh no, RMA. But it came back with Bob Work and the third offset. And I think it still lives. In fact, actually, I've seen RMA again. Like it's back. All the AI, new military revolution. We like it. We like this idea that technology can find us an easier way out of these wars. But in practice, I think because it didn't advocate specific platforms or munitions, then it runs into the vagaries of what the services want to buy. Sorry, that was very long-winded.
So I wrote a book that will turn 30 next year that was closely related to your ideas about identity. It was the closed world about computers and military strategy in the Cold War. And the thing that really strikes me, especially given what Harold just said, is that I would not see the RMA as a revolution at all. I think it's a continuous, unbroken line from World War II all the way up. And it's centered on the idea of remote control, getting the man out of the loop. That was a really popular phrase in the 40s and 50s. And the first air defense system, continental air defense system, was the semi-automatic ground environment built in the 50s. It had a provision for incoming aircraft to be tracked automatically and for fighter aircraft to be sent to engage them automatically under control of that system. I doubt it was ever actually used like that, but that was the idea. And so that, unmanned, it wasn't unmanned, but it was still remote control. And to me, that's the core of the concept. And I just wanted to tell one little story about the relation between identity of the Air Force in particular and those systems. So the SAGE control centers were these huge concrete blockhouses that were hardened against nuclear weapons. And yet, for some unobvious reason, a lot of them were co-located with strategic air command bases, which made them bonus targets in the event of a war. And this story may be apocryphal, but I heard it from more than one person when I was interviewing people about this, that they were co-located in that way because the SAGE commanders wanted access to the Strategic Air Command bases for their nice commissaries and other services. And the last little vignette I'll say is that, you know, that project SAGE kind of morphed into the Strategic Air Command Control System, SACCS. And if you look at the early 60s, you see almost immediately this whole proliferation of other arms of the Air Force acquiring things that end in CS, control system. They all wanted to have their own control system. So, you know, ultimately for me, this has always been about, you know, getting the God's eye view of the battlefield from a distant location, being able to track everything everywhere in real time, and then controlling it remotely. So, you know, again, unbroken line from World War II straight on up.
I think the Air Force in that plays such a huge role because it fits so nicely with their idea of strategic bombing. And then I actually interviewed John Warden for this book with my Air Force guy. John Warden's like an Air Force god, but he's also a colonel that got fired for being insubordinate. And he was one of the ones who came up with the effects, you know, the centers of gravity, right? And then Deb Tula is one of his kind of mentees that comes up. But, you know, I talked to John Warden and he was like, yeah, I didn't listen to ONA. I don't care about Andy Marshall. But he saw how the technology and the ideas about technology fit very nicely with his ideas about strategic air power. And so it's been really interesting to me as somebody who came from an Air Force background, watching the Air Force being able to adopt these technological narratives very neatly and nicely in order to always come back to strategic bombing, some version.
We're going to go to Rose and Tobias, and then I've got two questions from online.
Thank you so much, Jack. It was really a fascinating briefing. But I just wanted to query you a bit because your history is very much focused domestically on the U.S. and its services. And I'm accustomed to thinking about the history of the acquisition of ballistic missiles as related to the competition with the USSR. You know, we made off with our bunch of German missileers after World War II. They made off with their bunch of German missileers. And then there was a competition, and there was the missile gap, and there was, you know, the space race, and it was all kind of tangled up in this notion of who's going to deploy a ballistic missile at intercontinental range first in order to be able to threaten each other with nuclear weapons. So that's kind of the history that's deeply embedded in my brain. So I'm just wondering how you weave these two things together, because I think your story focused domestically is absolutely legitimate as well. But how do these two things fit together?
Yeah, and Rose is, as always, absolutely correct, right? You can't tell the story of the cruise missile without telling the story of the negotiations that were happening between the US and the USSR over ballistic missiles, right? And actually, a lot of the stagnation when it comes to ballistic missiles is part and parcel of the detente and the negotiations and the kind of the way the strategic context between the US and the USSR changed. And the book references some of this, but not all of it. But, you know, Kissinger used cruise missiles very instrumentally in some of his negotiations. So you see like this relationship between not just kind of how many ballistic missiles we had or what kind we had, but also kind of their knock-on influence on other types of missiles that we were willing to develop. And I think when you look at the German example about the V2 rocket, really, really important, right? The US isn't particularly interested in working on these until the end of the Cold War and the Germans' advancement. So you see at the beginning of the Cold War also this real influence from the experiences and the expertise from Germany. So you're absolutely right. And in the book, we tangentially, I will say that the primary focus of the book is the period from the end of the Cold War up to close to today. And in that, definitely the Russia story is less important. And actually, you find in this moment of hegemony, you have less international influences into the systems that the US is choosing to buy. And instead, I think you could almost argue that the US becomes this kind of entrepreneur of a certain type of unmanned, right? Where people thought that the Predator and the Reaper were the future of unmanned. And it's somewhat interesting now that the US really is not the leader in a lot of the unmanned development. You know, and like you, the Chinese, the Iranian, the North Korean development of conventional strike, long range strike, as something that the US has almost completely abdicated, is really, really fascinating. And maybe like that's the interesting phenomenon of the last 30 years is the lack of interaction between those two. And then will the US look at what's been happening in these other countries as an influence to what it does in the next 10 to 15 years? You'd think so. I mean, the US watched what was happening in Israel in the 1970s, and that really influenced a lot of its kind of precision guided munition development. You would think that what's happening today would have a large influence on the arsenals we develop. But it generally, those external influences, that's Congress, that's the big hand has to come in, because otherwise the services just continue to buy what they like to buy.
Bias?
Thank you so much, Ray, for a fascinating talk. You refer to the external factors or out of the Pentagon, out of those factors. To what extent did you see anything to the defense industry or the industry, and also their developments? If we're coming from the classical, traditional defense industry now to the commercial tech with dual use, but now even like Andrill that is really specialized on unmanned. Are those factors, or is really kind of the center of gravity for these ideas really within governmental agencies, etc., or they're even gatekeepers who can like be able to share the way?
Yeah, that is such a great question. And you know, we were focused on unmanned, so that does like kind of change. There's a lot of stories about manned platforms that are not in this book, right? Most often, industry followed defense demand. So very rarely in our story are we seeing companies that are willing to go investment. Shuttering successful defense industry because they're just not interested, and then having to restart it, you know, very quickly. But really good, so a company that defies that is General Atomics. So General Atomics watches what's happening in Israel with the Pioneer UAV and was like, I think the US could use this. And the US kind of like mildly adopts it, but not in a way that really is sustainable for a firm in the long term. It's not till 9/11. You know, 9/11 happens and they're like, wow, like General Atomics already has this thing. Now demand suddenly increases. But you very rarely see that kind of trajectory where, you know, industry invests in something and then the DoD decides that actually industry, you were right. We should have invested in that. I think it's maybe different for basic technologies. Anduril, I feel like is somewhat seeking to be that. But if you look at what they're actually creating, it's actually very closely aligned to what DoD has said that it wants. And they have not actually produced something, as opposed to General Atomics, who produced something before having very significant demand. And there was an interesting panel a few months ago where General Atomics and Anduril were on the same panel. And I hope I'm going to quote them correctly, but I think General Atomics said that Anduril was the Theranos of defense tech.
Sure.
They're like, so I think you know, watching Anduril to see what they're actually able to produce would be really important in their trajectory about whether they'll be able to do. And you know, you can look at General Atomics and say, hey, look, they don't have the right systems.
Really appreciate hearing your thoughts when you say experience and connection regarding the
Knew it would come up. And the book is actually relatively agnostic on ethics because the book is a story of why people make choices. It's not a story of why should they make choices. And one of the reviewer comments was, why isn't there more ethics? And actually, we viewed the ethics as being used rather instrumentally. So there are really clear historical examples of the US military not adopting unmanned technology because of ethical concerns. Those ethical concerns tend to be diminished in war. And so, the US, I think, in general, ethics can explain why we haven't invested in mines, for example, but it has been used in the past very instrumentally. And I don't think, so I'm rather agnostic about like whether unmanned systems make war or less ethical. But I do think that states can use the concern about ethics instrumentally to justify or not justify their investment in them. That's such a political science answer.
All right, so, question from Artem Chastyuk, who is an AI ethics and policy fellow at Stanford Medicine, but does not have an ethics question.
Oh, thank God.
What are you seeing around innovation in medical technologies on the battlefield? What is the interest in novel technologies versus using tried and tested tech? And I would just mention that the book that came out in the Bridging the Gap book series at Oxford University Press just prior to Jackie and Julia's book was Tanisha Fazal's The Hidden Costs of Military Medicine, which isn't actually on that, but it is a great book on military medicine.
Yeah, well, here's actually a great, here's when somebody asks a question, you're like, oh, you should go write that. So we don't have a lot. And there's nothing in the book about autonomy and medical support. I'm actually hearing a lot like around the edges about people who are very interested now, especially after watching a war that is very, very bloody in Ukraine, about thinking about the ways in which technology can influence military medicine. And so I don't have any good insights on it, but I highly recommend that the Tanisha Fazal book. And then I think this is a place that's ripe for other investments.
And just to mention, just on Nisha's book, which is just really extraordinary, looks sort of Civil War to the present, just looks at the way in which advances in military medicine mean that there are many more people in war who survive than used to be the case. And so when decision makers are thinking about the costs of going to war, they need to think about not just the casualty deaths, but also the casualty wounded and the need to take care of people for many years to come. Yes, Rosa Two-Finger, and then we'll go to the patient person in the back.
Two-Finger, and that is just somewhat accidentally. I've run into at a cocktail party a young entrepreneur here in the Valley who's actually delivering blood to the front with unmanned systems, and he's shown me on his iPhone a little briefing of how it works. But there are some unmanned systems operating in Ukraine to deliver medical devices, but also blood to the front lines.
Interesting. Great. Okay.
Yeah.
Very patient. Thank you.
Thanks for the great talk. I'm wondering whether your theory explains why the United States has underinvested in electronic warfare and has been surprised by the effectiveness of Russian EW against our unmanned systems in Ukraine.
Yeah, I would say absolutely. Electronic warfare is not a core mission or identity for any of the services. It's also not physical, which means that it can be less, you're less tied to it as like a platform. And so absolutely, I mean, I actually watched this as an Air Force officer where we would have better electronic warfare on our red air than we would have on the blue air that we were fighting with in an exercise. So, that none of the services have really adopted this as a core identity. And so I think that definitely helps explain it.
Who should? Should all of them?
Well, because electronic warfare works across domains, I think that I think there are ways in which it can fit into mission sets that the services already identify as core mission sets. So the Air Force investing in EW platforms at the same kind of level or priority as they're investing in their radar systems, their air radar systems, the Army investing in ground-based electronic warfare. The problem is that the electromagnetic spectrum works across domains. I mean, it's rather, and so you have to make decisions about, especially if you're using offensive jamming, you have to deconflict with all the other active activity occurring in the EM spectrum with the other domains. So it's kind of a complicated acquisition choice because it does not have to be inherently joint, but it must be inherently deconflicted at a joint level.
Awesome. Last question, we're going to go to Ken. Oh, actually, we have two. Let's put them both on the table. So Ken, and we'll take Owen, Harold. All right, we'll take all three. We'll put them on the table. Jackie, you'll finish. Okay.
I wanted to ask you about another kind of domestic consideration that I didn't know about, which seems to be that one of the ways in which drones were particularly useful during the global war on terror was that you could deploy them to lots of countries without crossing some threshold that might require, say, congressional approval or oversight. And I was wondering if that came up in your research.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Right.
Okay.
Yep. Go ahead.
Yeah, I come a visiting student. And when we look at the top 100 defense company in 2024, we can set a 40 of the revenue from the defense contract as a sharehold. And we can say more than half of the United States company, exists at 9. However, the Chinese SOE, none of them surpassed the threshold. So I think that's very interesting to ask why Chinese large SOE in the military field are much more market driven. Yeah, and when it comes to technology, I want to ask what's key barriers to influence American companies to do the technological innovation?
Great, thanks. And Harold?
So very broadly, my question would be, you talk about why the US military adopts certain ideas that drive acquisitions, but it also forgets certain ideas. And so the electronic warfare question made me think about this because electronic warfare was huge in Vietnam.
Yeah.
I mean, across services that was used, especially the Air Force. And I wonder if it's the combination of forgetting something like coin after Vietnam, plus the permissive environment in the post-Cold War that kind of all the market signals for why you need this stuff kind of disappear for a while. So anyway, the role of forgetting as opposed to remembering in your story.
I think
there's 3 minutes.
There's a willful forgetfulness that the US has with some of there are wars that we just don't want to fight again. And therefore we forget about some of the lessons there. There are technologies we don't want to use because it implies that we are in a type of conflict that we don't like to fight. Landmines, naval mines being a good example. And so I think there are technologies that we are more willing to forget because we want to feel like we can control the type of wars that we fight in. On the why China is more market driven, holy cow, that's a great question. And I would love to talk to you more about the answer to that. It's really depressing. I don't know enough about the Chinese bureaucratic process, but I know the US, especially in the last 30 years, has highly bureaucratized the way in which we buy the defense technology. And because of that, you've created a market that is not strictly rational and has led to the state we're in today. And then the political risk, absolutely. We actually interviewed Leon Panetta for the book, and then we're introducing a podcast on March 26th, and he'll be in the podcast as well. And he talked very extensively about how that was so important with the investment in the Predators, especially when he was in head of the CIA, was they wanted something that could fly but also persist over a political territory, and they didn't want the fallout of the of using something that was manned. So I think that is absolutely a huge part of the story. And actually, Jim Roche, Secretary of the Air Force at the time, also talks about that and how important that was in those decisions.
Awesome. Well, what a great talk. It's a great book. So happy to have you here. And books are on sale in the back. So thank you.